right, so again, thank you all for joining us here tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce Jane O'Neill. Jane O'Neill is the owner of Culturally Curious. She holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She is a New Hampshire native. We won't hold that against her. And she has worked at some of New Hampshire's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. And tonight she'll be talking to us about fierce females, women artists that have broken the mold. Women have long been the subject of art, often depicted as nothing more than objects of desire. How do images of women change when women become the creators? This program examines the history of women in art in brief, and then explores the lives, careers, and works of several major women artists from the Renaissance to the 20th century. So all 20 of us or so live, let's give a big round of applause to Jane for joining us here tonight. And Jane, you can take it away. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Robert. I am so happy to be giving this presentation, and I don't think there's anything better than a round of applause over Zoom. So thank you, everybody. So as Robert said, my background is in art history and in education. And what that means is I really like looking at images, but I really love talking with people about them. So if this were a face-to-face program, it would be probably a little bit more interactive. But I'm going to show you a lot of great images tonight, and I'm going to move sort of quickly through them. My PowerPoint has 81 slides, and we're going to be talking for about an hour. So this will be really fast, and I'm going to do my absolute best to keep you interested and engaged. So we've got our Rosie the Riveter here flexing on our title screen. And this is a very familiar image. And I think people always associate it with the sense of female empowerment. It's a much more complicated image because, of course, it was made by a man, and it was made by a man at a time when they're trying to entice women who were already taking care of households and families to also go to work and take care of the country. So it's a sort of complicated image, but she does look beautiful and she does look tough. And I think that still resonates with so many people today. And we'll see how it continues to. So just to get started, just to get us oriented, this big idea here is that throughout the history of art, men have been depicted as triumphant heroes, people of action, and women have generally been depicted as idle at best, oftentimes. So on the left here, we have Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon crossing the Alps from about 1800. And, you know, he's on a mountainside, he's commanding an army, there's wind, you know, billowing all around him, and he's raised his hand, and you have every confidence that he can accomplish what he's setting out to do. And then Edmund Tarbell's beautiful woman over here on the right, it's just a painting called Reverie. And we see so many images of women like this who are just lying on couches or reading books or writing letters or just lost in thought. So we have this real discrepancy throughout the history of art in terms of how women are represented. All right. And part of that is because men have traditionally been the makers, right? Men have been active creators, and women have been the passive subjects and sometimes the passive objects. I love this image to sort of underscore that idea. The artist here is the French artist Gérôme, and it's just called Working in Marble. He painted several images of artists at work, but it isn't too often that you just see women who are perfectly replicated as a static sculpture. So this is a painting from about 1890. So our big idea here is being fierce, right? So what does it mean to be fierce? Well, I've defined it for us for our purposes for tonight. It's women who created art that defied expectations and pushed beyond the boundaries of what was considered appropriate, acceptable, or desirable for their time. So you've got to love this image over here on the right. This is by Baroque artist Isabetta Siriani. And the image here is called Timoclea Killing Her Rapist. It's from 1659. There's a whole story that goes along with this, but really our artist here is just giving us this moment of violence, this moment of sort of female empowerment where she throws her rapist down a well. Now, our artist in this case ends up dying mysteriously at the age of 27, but in her short lifetime, she championed the artistic education of other women, and she championed women as subject matters. So, so clearly she was, in her short life, kind of a force to be reckoned with. So if we continue on thinking about this theme of fierce women in art, here's another representation of what I would consider a fierce woman in art. This is a film still from a video by a Swiss artist named, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, Pippoletti Rist. The film still is from 1997, and it's called Ever is Over All. And this is in a number of museum collections, including the New Museum. And so what we're seeing is in just this film still, and I think that this is sort of the most popular moment from, or the most published moment from this video that she created, is a beautiful woman in this kind of lovely blue dress walking down a city street in striking red shoes too, right? And here she is smashing a car window, which just seems to be really unexpected, really out of the norm for what a beautiful woman in a dress might be doing. And this is generally just seen as an expression of kind of an anti-authoritarian sentiment and an expression of freedom against the norms of feminine behavior. And if you're a fan of pop music at all, it might be sort of a familiar scene because the pop sensation Beyonce sort of references this exact moment in a recent video for her song called Hold Up. So this was a video from 2016. And Beyonce is someone who is very wisely kind of trading on this concept of fierceness as part of her identity, or at least kind of her public persona. So she includes it in a lot of her promotional materials. She also includes the other F word, feminist, with a lot of her materials. And I promise this isn't just a presentation on Beyonce, but I also think it's interesting to note that she even channels the classic Rosie the Riveter poster here that we're so familiar with. So diving into all of our material for tonight, I wanted to give you an overview in terms of how we're going to progress. I'm going to give the quickest overview of the history of women in art. So we'll look at sort of how they've contributed to art through the ages, and then touch on some of the barriers for their participation. And then I have all of these artists that I'm just going to give you a little bit of words of wisdom about. We'll probably look at about 3 to 6 images from each of these artists, just as sort of a quick general overview, but I wanted to give a real great cross-section of female artists from the Baroque period to present day. And then we'll just wrap up with sort of what's happening with female artists looking ahead. So there's a lot to cover. And I should mention that the image that I have on the screen is by a French artist, Labille Guillard. It's a French painter who has created a self-portrait with 2 of her students. And I think that it's a huge painting. It's on view, it's about 7 feet by 5 feet. It's on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it's just so beautiful. These gorgeous dresses, these beautiful women, and involved in actively making art. I think that this has always been a really popular work on view there. So let's dive into this history, and we're going to start way, way back. Cave painting. We're looking at an image here from Chauvet Cave that dates to about 30,000 BC. And of course, what we're looking at here are mostly line drawings of animals, but they're lined up so beautifully here. I love this row of horse heads. We've got these sort of fighting rhinoceroses here. And so this is one of the earliest cave paintings ever discovered. But if you're familiar with the history of prehistoric art, you probably know that in caves sort of across the world, but especially in France, we see these kinds of depictions of animals represented again and again on prehistoric cave walls. And you'll also notice in this picture here, the silhouette of all of these handprints. This is from the Peshmeral cave, also in France, and it dates to about 25,000 BC. So it has only been recently, in just the past decade, that these prehistoric handprints, these silhouettes, and sometimes we know that these prehistoric artists actually probably blew the colored pigment out of almost like a straw to create some of these silhouettes. We know that anthropologists and archaeologists have determined that about 3/4 of all of the handprints found in prehistoric caves were the hands of women. So traditionally, we're talking about, prehistoric man creating these images, and that they had something to do with hunting or with rituals or that sort of thing. But it sort of completely changes the narrative when we begin to think of them as women, as creators, in such an early time in human history too. So zipping forward way up to ancient Greek culture. Oftentimes, when we think of ancient Greek culture, the strength of their painting was oftentimes decorative painting for vases, like we see here. So both of these paintings, both of these vases feature red figure painting. So if you look very closely, you can see a number of different figures on the left and on the right. And these are generally about 5th century BC. And on the left, it's a battle scene. And on the right over here is actually a teacher having an affair with his young student. So these are sort of typical topics in ancient Greek art: war and homoerotic love. So I think it was safe for many art historians to assume that it was predominantly male artists who were decorating these vases. But one artist sort of stands out who is very different. And this is a sort of a masterwork from antiquity. This is actually a Roman work. It was excavated in a house in Pompeii in the 3rd or 4th century. And it's a battle scene. It's Alexander the Great battling Darius III here. And this is Alexander over here. This is Darius. And we can see, just the chaos of this scene. And what we do know is that this Roman mosaic was actually a copy of an ancient Greek painting by someone named Helen of Egypt. So one of the most famous works here from the ancient world was inspired by the work of at least one female painter in this case. The mosaic that we're looking at is absolutely huge. It measures almost like 9 feet by 17 feet. Here's a detail here. And so you can only imagine what the original work looked like that inspired this work in particular. And it's kind of wonderful to know that it was most likely this female artist, Helen of Egypt. As we continue to cruise through the ages here, we're now up to the Middle Ages, and we're thinking about medieval manuscript illumination. And a frequent subject in medieval manuscripts is the subject of the scribe himself. So on the right here, we have Saint Mark, depicted as a scribe, and this dates to about 1120. And then on the left, we have the Edwin Psalter. And so this is probably a self-portrait of the monk who was involved in working as a scribe or creating the illuminations within the text. And he's often been described as the Prince of Scribes, the first among all scribes. So rightfully so, art historians have always thought of these medieval manuscript illuminations as primarily being done by male artists. But we do have at least a few examples of female artists who illustrated these texts as well. And so what we're looking at here is a manuscript with a self-portrait of the artist that dates to about 1290. And in this case, she signed it. Her name is, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Guda, G-U-D-A. And she writes, Guda, a sinner, wrote and painted this book. And this is actually one of the first women in Western civilization to create a signed self-portrait, which is really amazing. Anthropology gives us a lot of information too. What we're looking at here are the remains of a nun who lived about 900 years ago. And you'll probably notice from this very detailed photograph that there is this sort of chunk of blue mineral near her teeth here. And that would have been a pigment, ultramarine, something made from lapis lazuli. So if you think about an artist who might occasionally stick their paintbrush in their mouth, lapis lazuli was a pigment that was excavated from Afghanistan, about 4,000 miles away. It was as precious as gold. So here we know that a nun has a little bit of lapis lazuli in her mouth, which probably signifies she was an excellent artist if she had access to these kinds of materials. So it's always interesting to see what archaeology and anthropology can contribute to our understanding of women in the arts. So we're moving on up to the modern era in this kind of crash course in terms of what women have contributed to the arts over the ages. And I'd like to introduce you to Edmonia Lewis. And she is, or was, an artist of African American and Native American descent. She was born in 1844 in America, and she was born free. And she received really minimal artistic training early on, but she was very good at it with only minimal training. And so what she would do was create these kind of portrait busts of notable people. And in this case, we're looking at a portrait bust of the abolitionist John Brown. And she used the sale of these busts to go to Rome and receive formal training. And so ultimately her work is comparable to, some of the great neoclassical sculptors of the 19th century. And the work that we're looking at here is called The Death of Cleopatra. It's over 3,000 pounds. Edmonia Lewis was only about 32 years old when she created this, and she submitted it to the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. And believe it or not, this was Cleopatra was a very popular subject at the time. It was, literary and highbrow and history, and so there were a lot of people interested in it. But there were very few artists who portrayed Cleopatra in the throes of death. She was oftentimes just sort of contemplating suicide. But this was, according to some art critics at the time, that this was kind of ghastly or kind of repellent, because we see her kind of a little bit disheveled, a little bit out of control as she dies in this moment. And maybe for that reason, this became the most popular work at the entire exhibition. So Edmonia Lewis really just exceeded so in such a spectacular way for a young woman of her background at that time. I should mention, though, that this work was essentially lost for almost a century after this exhibition. Believe it or not, it ended up in a Chicago saloon. It then marked a horse's grave at a suburban racetrack, and then it was eventually discovered at a salvage yard in the 1980s. It's now in the collection of the Smithsonian Museum. So that sort of says something, too, about the legacy of female artists, even those that succeeded during their time. So sort of wrapping up this history is this portrait here. This is done by the female artist Alice Neal, and it's a portrait of an art historian named Linda Nochlin with her daughter Daisy, and this was done in 1973. And the reason I include this image here is because Linda Nochlin wrote a really sort of groundbreaking essay that's called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" She wrote that in 1971. And just to give you the absolute thumbnail view, the Cliff's Notes of why have there been no great female artists, well, one is there was a real lack of training. Women were literally prohibited from participating in training as artists. There was a lack of opportunities there. Nochlin also talks about that with male artists, there's this myth of the male genius, the male genius artist. So when we think about this in art terms, that means, oftentimes we talk about Michelangelo or Picasso as being a genius. I am very guilty of doing this too. But we rarely talk about women artists with the same kind of praise and with the same kind of terms. So I think we have been programmed to a certain degree to not really accept the concept of a woman artist who's sort of working against tradition, and it doesn't quite fit in with our notion of genius. So just to kind of back up this notion of lack of training, here's just a couple of images. This is called the American School. It's a painting from the 1700s of an American expatriate artist, Benjamin West's school for young artists who are training to sort of bring their talents back to America. Of course, conspicuously, we don't see any women. We always talk about, women having a seat at the table. They weren't even allowed through the door. And this continues up through the 19th century as well. This is a photograph from the École des Beaux-Arts in France. And one of the major barriers that kept women out of many of these art schools was the fact that they were using live nude models to study anatomy and to train artists. So that was absolutely considered something that any sort of upstanding woman shouldn't be a part of. So just to wrap up this whole concept of the history and sort of where we are now, this lack of access, this lack of training means that less than 5% of the artists in the modern sections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art are women, but 85% of the nudes are women. So this activist group called the Guerrilla Girls, who create these great posters and do programs, they say, do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum of Art? Which just goes back to this idea of women as women, not as creators, but women as passive subjects or objects. So switching gears, we're going to dive in to who some of these great artists were. And again, we're going to be sort of flying through it just to give us a sort of a thumbnail sketch, but a good sense of some of the best that have come along. So our first artist here is Artemisia Gentileschi. She was a Baroque artist, and this is just such a fabulous self-portrait that she has provided here. And it's sort of, in some ways, kind of thumbing her nose at her male contemporaries, because she has painted herself as the very allegory of painting. So she is the symbol, she is the very representation of painting, which is something that male artists could not do because allegories were strictly female. And so this is embedded with all of these little symbols and codes that contemporary members of society would have recognized. But the first and foremost is that she's dark-haired and she's a little disheveled. She's also wearing this long necklace with a mask on it that represents the art. So all of these elements here really sort of speak to a little bit of power that she has in this role as a female artist. And she became a prominent artist at this time because she came from a family of artists. And that's true for so many female artists for such a long time. They were trained by their families. This is one of her first known works, one of her first most successful works, and it dates to 1610. It's called Susanna and the Elders. And this is a biblical scene that provides an opportunity for a lot of artists to paint a female nude. The story here is that there's this beautiful young woman, Susanna, who's going to bathe, and these two sort of lecherous men not only observe her bathing, but then sort of attack her. And so it's sort of a typical story in the history of art. Actually, Artemisia Gentileschi's father had painted the same thing, but a lot is read into this in terms of who Artemisia was, because I think you could make the case that her Susanna here is really sort of responding to the advances and to the whisperings of these older men in maybe a more realistic way than the way her father had painted Susanna. I think the Susanna on the left seems sort of mildly annoyed. I mean, she's just rolling her eyes, right? And the Susanna on the right is, actively twisting away in what seems like sort of an ungainly position, and her face certainly expresses if not horror, but some frustration and disdain for what's happening. And Artemisia Gentileschi's works only get ever more violent. I think this is the most violent series of images we're about to see. But they're also very dark, and because they're in the style of the most prominent Italian artist from the time, whose name was Caravaggio. And Caravaggio painted the same subject here, which is Judith slaying Holofernes. And just to break it down, the story of Judith is essentially one of a young woman who goes in to seduce the captain of an army who is kind of suppressing her people. So she's willing to sort of seduce, to use her feminine wiles, but ultimately she has to do something very, very brave and very violent, and she ends up beheading this like army captain. And here she is with her maidservant doing it. And I want to stress that Judith is the woman at the top here. This is her maidservant here. So as Holofernes is sort of pushing up, Judith is pushing down, and of course there's kind of blood spattering in every direction. And as chaotic and as violent as this image seems, there's just this wonderful sort of organization of these diagonal lines of his legs going back in the distance here, and the maidservant's arm sort of balancing that out in this beautiful V, and then that kind of interesting push-pull right at the center there. And just to show you, this is how a male contemporary had exhibited or had portrayed the exact same subject. And you could probably make all sorts of cases about how Artemisia Gentileschi was able to capture something that showed maybe a little bit more female power in her works. And just to show you, she continues on with this thread for quite some time. And art historians sort of love to talk about the fact that she herself was raped and was involved in a really sort of protracted trial against her rapist, where she herself was tortured with thumb screws so that she would tell the truth. So and you can, I think, appreciate all of these images without even knowing that backstory. But she certainly created some very powerful women along the way in her career. So moving into the 19th century, and I'm sorry to say that there aren't too many prominent female artists between Gentileschi and our first artist here, Rosa Bonheur, from the 19th century. This is a portrait of the artist done by a male artist named Dubuffet, and it's done in 1857. And it's a very striking image because we have this young, beautiful artist in this gorgeous dress, just leaning up against a bull, as one does, as though they're best friends. But this speaks to really who Rosa Bonheur was. And she came from a family of artists like Gentileschi that specialized specifically in paintings of animals. So her career is really marked by images like this. They're largely sentimental. They're incredibly skilled depictions of horses, cattle, dogs, cats, goats, sheep. This is what she really specialized in, and she was really celebrated for it too. But she had a couple of major, sort of monumental successes early on in her career that kind of helped to define who she was as an artist. So this is her, probably her best known work, which is called The Horse Fair from 1855. It's at the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's roughly 8 feet by 16 feet. So this is a picture that's really designed to overwhelm you. And I have to say, throughout the history of art, it's very rare for women to be painting on this scale. So what she is showing here is a very popular and well-known horse market that took place in Paris. And she went there for about a year and a half prior to painting this. And she sketched twice a week dressed as a man so as not to attract attention to herself. And this was, widely celebrated when it was exhibited. And she referred to it as her own sort of Parthenon frieze, all of these animated horses kind of lined up and overlapping each other, kind of telling a story from left to right here. So Rosa Bonheur is just this fabulous kind of rule breaker. These are two photographs of her. She, as an artist, as a female artist, she was visiting abattoirs and veterinary schools. She dissected animals. She wanted to know everything about the animals that she was painting. She received permission, believe it or not, you had to receive permission from the French government to wear pants and to move about these spaces freely so that she wouldn't draw attention to herself. She smoked, as you can see from the image on the left, and she was openly gay. And I think you're going to love this. She once told a male friend, "If only you knew how little I care for your sex, you wouldn't get such queer ideas in your head. The fact is, in the way of males, I only care for the bulls that I paint." So she was a force to be reckoned with, clearly, and she was actually the first woman to ever receive the Grand Cross by the French Legion of Honor, which you can see her wearing on the right with one of her longtime partners. So she was a fascinating person, and she was actually probably the best known female artist in France in the 19th century, which probably comes as a surprise because you have people whose names are household names now, like Mary Cassatt, who are also working in France at this time. And I think a lot of people don't give Mary Cassatt a lot of credit. They don't really think of her as being a fierce female, but I'm going to do my best to convince you that she was. So she is one of maybe three prominent female impressionist artists who were working in France in the later part of the 19th century. So this is Cassatt on the left in a self-portrait from 1878. There's another self-portrait here at the center by Marie Bracquemond from 1870. And then a portrait by Edward Manet of Berthe Morisot. And that is from 1872. So these three women were really probably the most celebrated, the most honored of the French Impressionists. And you can see that stylistically, their work is very similar. In terms of subject matter, their work is very similar. A lot of domestic scenes, for sure. A lot of images of motherhood, for sure. Now, what sets Mary Cassatt apart from this? Mary Cassatt was introduced to the Impressionist circle by the artist Edgar Degas, and you see him here in a self-portrait from 1863. And they were never really rumored to be romantically involved, but they were very good friends. And I think what's important to know about Degas is that as a man, as an artist, he could go out in Paris at night and he would go to these what were called cafe concerts. You can sort of think of them as like proto-vaudeville. They were a little bit raunchy and they were humorous and they were musical, and they attracted people from all walks of life, a lot of times women from lower classes, like you can see here. So Degas was creating these great works about looking at women and experiencing these performances. And poor Mary Cassatt, by contrast, was creating images like the ones that we saw before, a lot of images of a woman and her child. And I think it's safe to say that these images really look like these women are kind of bored, right? They sort of look like that first image by Edmund Tarbell that we had started off with. And in some cases, these images that Mary Cassatt was painting really sort of seem to express these kind of constrained lives. These women who are really sort of relegated to the domestic sphere and to these social rules of their class that only permit sort of a certain kind of behavior. These are images from the 1880s, Lady at Tea and The Tea. But Mary Cassatt did do something a little bit different. She has a series of women who go to the Paris Opera. So the image on the left is called Woman in a Pearl Necklace from 1879. And this is the interior on the right of the Paris Opera. And I just wanted to give you a sense of what it looks like if you've never been inside. It's sort of a horseshoe shape, and it has all of these kind of balcony boxes here. And just like today, when people went to the Paris Opera to see a show, you'd get dressed up and you'd go and you'd check out everybody else who was dressed up. It was a see and be seen experience. So with this lady in the pearl necklace on the left, this is actually a portrait of Mary Cassatt's sister. And I love this image because it's just a little bit ambiguous here. I believe her sister Lydia is sitting in front of a mirror. So the opera boxes that she would be looking at are actually painted behind her. But Mary Cassatt leaves it ambiguous because this body that is right behind Lydia Cassatt conspicuously does not have a pearl necklace on it. So you can speculate all sorts of things happening here. But as I mentioned, this is a series that she does, and she does engravings and she does paintings, and they all become images about women who get to go out and take on the role of somebody who gets to do the looking as opposed to being the object who is looked at. So I love this image of, the two girls in the opera box here who are sort of hiding behind this fan, but using their opera glasses to kind of either check out the show or check out other people. And then there's this amazing picture from Mary Cassatt from 1878. It's at the Museum of Fine Arts. You've probably seen it in person. And art historians absolutely love this picture because we have this really sort of beautiful but serious looking woman dressed in black with her opera glasses. And we know she's not looking at the stage. She's looking right out across from her, right? She's looking across the entire theater at somebody else in an opera box. And and of course she's resting her elbow on this red banister here, and you can just trace it all the way back to this other gentleman behind her who's also got his elbow resting on that red banister, and he's checking her out. So it's all about who's doing the looking and who's being seen. Basically, according to philosophy, essentially, you're powerless. You have a sense of powerlessness if you're being looked at, and you have a real sense of power if you're doing the looking. So Mary Cassatt really sort of gives women a sense of power in this series. Oh, here's the close-up of that man. and here's just sort of the classic art historical comparison here. The painting on the left is by Renoir. It's called La Loge from 1874. And of course, we just have a woman who's being presented as essentially merely decorative. She looks like a China doll. She's got all the pearls and all the jewelry and the flowers and all of this and that, but she's been given no agency. And meanwhile, her companion here is very clearly checking out other people with his opera glasses over here, and he has all the agency. So Mary Cassatt has a little bit of that fierceness in her. The next artist that I wanted to showcase here is one that I think everybody is familiar with to some degree, and that is Georgia O'Keeffe. I love this photograph of her. She is really a superstar of American modernism, but of course, whenever anybody thinks of her, they think of her and the flowers. So flowers have been a traditional subject matter for women going back centuries. And it's sort of fitting, right? I mean, they're beautiful. It's something that you could have in your home. You can work it on a small scale. And so it makes sense that it's been sort of a feminine subject for so long. But we'll see with O'Keeffe's work that she makes it sort of revolutionary. These are two images that she created in the 19-teens that sort of show this early interest, not only in floral still lifes, but in modernism too. And I think it gives you a sense of sort of where she's going as an artist. And where she's going, of course, is to these kind of monumental paintings, like the one that we see here. This is called Red Canna from 1924, where you feel like these flowers are being lit from within, and you feel like you, the viewer, are almost inhabiting them. You are up close and personal with all of the folds and petals of these flowers. And just to underscore how revolutionary this is for the time, let's just compare it to Baroque still life painting, floral still life by another female artist here. And, side by side, we can see, the tradition of floral still life paintings is to provide this like overabundance of all these different kinds of flowers, and they're spilling out of a vase. And there's all these, exquisite details where you can rest your eye. And of course, Georgia O'Keeffe is giving us something that's totally different, an entirely new way to look at the same subject. And so another vision here is this one's called Gray Line with Black, Blue, and Yellow from 1923. And of course, you can't talk about Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings without talking about how they're generally perceived, and that is that they're really paintings about the female anatomy. I love showing Georgia O'Keeffe paintings to groups because inevitably people start blushing, people start giggling. These paintings can really make people feel a little bit uneasy. They have that power still. Now, what's amazing to know is that theory that these are paintings of female genitalia was actually pushed forward by her husband, who was probably the most successful art promoter of the 20th century. And believe it or not, Georgia O'Keeffe denied it for decades, essentially throughout her life. She said they weren't in any way sexual, and despite that, of course, that's the commonly held belief. Here's another example of her work called Jack in the Pulpit 4 from 1930. And interestingly, in the 1970s, when we see sort of the rise of feminist art historians, they begin to sort of look back at Georgia O'Keeffe's body of work, and they reimagine it, despite what Georgia O'Keeffe said, as a statement of female empowerment because of its associations with the female anatomy. So Georgia O'Keeffe giving us something just so revolutionary for the time period. And of course, this incredible staying power too, because her work today sells at auction for more than any other female artist ever. All right, zooming along. So our next artist is probably the least well-known out of everyone I'm presenting here. And her name is Lee Miller. And she was a female war correspondent who covered the U.S. Army during World War II. She has a fascinating life. You could do a whole presentation or a whole dissertation on Lee Miller easily. She grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York. She's an American, and she moved to the city to study art as a teen. And she has one of these classic stories. Lee Miller knew all the right people and all the people in positions of power. Supposedly, she was going to cross the street in Manhattan, and a man saved her from being hit by a car, and that man just happened to be Condé Nast. And then, lo and behold, she has a career as a model for Vogue magazine and other publications. She began to work with famous artists like Edward Steichen, and then eventually she moves to Paris to work with the surrealist artist Man Ray. So the photograph on the left is by Lee Miller. The photograph on the right is an example of Man Ray's work, which is a metronome with a photograph of Lee Miller's eye. Lee Miller's photograph here, which is not a self-portrait, obviously it involves the human body, but it doesn't sexualize it in any way. It just gives you sort of this reorientation of it. And of course, there were a lot of surrealist artists who were creating images like this, but they were overtly sexual. So Lee Miller also already sort of has an interesting perspective. And then the war breaks out. And she was in London during the Blitz. And she decided, I need to be here and I need to photograph what I see. So her photographs have an incredible power, all their own. The image on the left is an exhausted nurse in Normandy a month after D-Day. And so she was part of a group of 40 nurses that were attached to this mobile hospital. And they had treated about 4,500 patients and only 50 of them had died. So you can just imagine the whole story unfolding in this tent behind this woman. This exuberant scene on the right is children celebrating the liberation of France in 1944. Such an amazing picture, and there's so much energy and enthusiasm to it. And believe it or not, there's a whole history of depictions of children in carriages and playing in a very similar way in the history of American art. So Lee Miller's work also kind of focused on death and destruction in Europe. The image on the right is an SS guard in a canal from 1945. Sorry, that's on the left, and a bombed chapel from 1940 on the right. But she also went to the camps. And so she documented several concentration camps, including Buchenwald and Dachau in 1945. And as whenever you see images of the concentration camps, they are striking and alarming. And I can only imagine what the men in these photographs thought as this beautiful photographer is sort of waltzing through and able to take these photographs of them when they are being treated so poorly and they are sort of at the poor state of their entire lives. Lee Miller, her most famous photograph is probably this one here, and in this case she is the subject and not the creator. She is sitting in Hitler's bathtub. This is a photograph from 1945. She had teamed up with an American photographer named David Sherman, who was a correspondent for Life. And shortly after they had been to the camps, they got access to Hitler's apartment, and they staged this very interesting photograph where they purposely put Hitler's photo on the edge of his bathtub. They put the little sculpture there on the right, and then there's that element of the hose from the bathtub that sort of loops down, almost sort of suggesting a noose behind her. So she was certainly a brave woman, and she certainly encountered quite a bit during her career, particularly as a war correspondent. So we have just a few more artists to hit in our just about an hour here. And Frida Kahlo is probably a name that most people are very familiar with. She has become sort of a worldwide sensation in recent years. And I think the photograph here really sort of encapsulates a pretty important detail of her life that impacts all of her work. And that is when she was 18 years old, she was involved in a trolley accident, which caused physical and emotional pain for the rest of her sort of short life. So as the bus and the trolley that she was on, as they collided, she was impaled with a railing from that trolley that sort of went through her pelvis. Which caused all sorts of problems in terms of trying to have a baby throughout the rest of her life. And in addition to that, she had several broken vertebrae. She had a broken leg in 3 places. She broke her collarbone. Her shoulder was dislocated. So, I mean, this was an accident that could have easily destroyed her. And so she was oftentimes bedridden, oftentimes hospitalized. She underwent about 30 surgeries over the course of the next few decades. So her work tends to be very personal because she was her own best subject. And they are remarkable in terms of the vulnerability that she shares in these images, where she's crying and she's showing the incredible physical pain that she's in. Of course, here she's wearing a brace. Her spine is represented as a broken column. And then, she's covered with these sort of nails or pins that, indicate how pained she is. Even the ground behind her is splitting open. And so these are motifs that she uses throughout her work. These works are from 1946. This one here is called The Tree of Hope, Remain Strong. She would oftentimes show herself sort of dual selves. In one portrait. So these are both representations of her, one on a hospital gurney with incisions, and another one sort of remaining strong with a back brace there, and sort of day and night kind of coming together in this picture. She's oftentimes associated with surrealism, but I think she sort of stands apart and on her own because her work is so unique. But this painting called The Wounded Deer is also from 1946, and this is generally thought of as a self-portrait that she created after sort of some unsuccessful surgeries where she was at a very dark point in her life, and she had gone through additional pain to try and fix the pain, but she was unsuccessful in finding a solution for the suffering that she was enduring. Strangely enough, she did give this to her friends as a wedding gift. And the last Frida Kahlo painting that I wanted to show, and these aren't sort of the typical Frida Kahlo paintings that you see in a nice little retrospective, which might be her self-portraits or her portraits with her husband. But this one is called The Dream of the Bed from 1940. And you can see that she's in this canopy bed, and on top of the canopy is this kind of skeletal figure who is lined with explosives. And apparently Frida Kahlo did sleep in a bed with a skeleton on it, because certainly there are sort of different beliefs about death in general when it comes to Mexican culture. But here she is sleeping underneath it, and it looks as though there's these green vines that are growing around her, which seem to offer sort of a sense of hope for rebirth and for growth there. So we have this kind of menacing specter of death up above her that seems like it could go off at any second, and then maybe a little bit of peace and regrowth underneath that. So Frida, having dealt with all of this physical pain throughout her life, is certainly a force to be reckoned with, and another fierce woman. One of our last artists is a printmaker, primarily a printmaker named Elizabeth Catlett. She's an American artist, and working sort of primarily during the Depression era, but with a long and impressive resume. And she primarily focused on figurative work, and she talked about wanting to make work for the people, for struggling people, and she talked about working primarily in kind of a realistic vein, because that is what, you know, the average person can connect with and really respond to. So one of Elizabeth Catlett's most famous works is this image here, which is a linoleum cut, and it's from 1952, and it's called Sharecropper. And so I think once you, even without knowing the subject, we get the sense that this is sort of a powerful figure. It's an African-American woman. We're looking at her from below, and Norman Rockwell famously said, you know, anytime you want to inspire awe in your subject, you shoot them from below. And so we're looking at her, and just the perspective here gives her a sort of this impressive physical presence. But once you know the title, you already know that this is a woman involved in sort of tenant farming, which led to a cycle of debt for so many African Americans. So we see strength here despite really sort of unfortunate circumstances, to say the least, and circumstances that were nearly impossible to escape. So Elizabeth Catlett's work was oftentimes focused on African American history. This is a print that she made called Harriet from 1975. So this is Harriet Tubman leading slaves on the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman is this big, powerful woman in the foreground. And even though it's nighttime, she is sort of surrounded in the silhouette of light so that we can see this really strong gesture that she's making here as she's guiding others forward. She's also holding a rifle, which is also something that you don't often see in the history of art, which would gives her, which probably adds to her sense of power and monumentality here. Other images that Elizabeth Catlett made refer to sort of the present day circumstances of African Americans. The image on the left is called "And a Special Fear for My Loved Ones," which shows a lynched man, a lynched Black man on the ground after being lynched with feet surrounded by the feet of the people that had lynched him. And then on the right is an image that's called the Civil Rights Congress from 1950. And again, we see a young Black male who's being sort of threatened by the KKK, by the hand of, by the skeletal hand that's holding a noose. And we see in her works very powerfully rendered the fear that many African Americans were living with and are still living with in our country today. As I mentioned before, Elizabeth Catlett was also making sculpture, and I love this sort of modernist sculpture that she created of the early African American poet Phillis Wheatley. So this is a bronze sculpture, two different perspectives of essentially the same work. It dates to 1973. There's one in the collection of the Smithsonian. And Phillis Wheatley, if you're familiar with her, she was the first African-American woman to publish a book of poetry. So she was born in West Africa and was apparently reading Greek and Latin by the age of 12 here in America. And so at the age of 14, she wrote her first poem, and apparently even George Washington praised her work. So she was from the 1700s, obviously. And here is a portrait that was done of Phillis Wheatley for her book from the 1700s. So we get a sense here that Elizabeth Catlett is sort of working from those early depictions, but she's created sort of this timeless, or also sort of a contemporary view of an intellectual African American woman. I just love that picture, or that sculpture. And our very last artist to consider here today is the Chinese American architectural designer Maya Lin. And of course, she is here in this photograph with her most popular work of art, which is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. She was a 21-year-old senior at Yale when she won the blind competition to design the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And I just love that photograph. I mean, you can just sense how absolutely enthusiastic she was by winning this. And these were the designs that she submitted. So you can see she had a very sort of simple concept, but also something that really sort of reflected the pain and suffering caused by that war. So in 2007, Maya Lin was ranked 10th on the list of America's favorite architects, and she has really sort of enjoyed an impressive reputation ever since securing this commission at a young age. But it did not go without a little bit of scandal at the time. Former presidential candidate Ross Perot referred to her as an egg roll when he found out who had won the competition. So let's take a look at this masterwork by Maya Lin. The work itself contains close to 60,000 names of soldiers that died in the war. Of course, it's in Washington, D.C., and it's in the shape of this V. One arm of the V points to the Washington Monument, as you can see here, and the other arm points to the Lincoln Memorial. And I think it's obvious, but it's important to say that this is made out of this dark stone, whereas everything else in Washington, D.C. tends to be, marble. It tends to be this sort of white celebratory stone. And this is really, it more or less functions more like a grave marker more so than a celebration. So it's made up of 246 panels that are made of black granite that's been polished to a very high finish. And so you've probably all seen or experienced images like this one, where you can go and find the name of a loved one or someone you served with, and reach out and actually connect with that name that's been etched in that stone but you also have the experience of looking at your own reflection as you do that. So there's kind of multiple layers to the experience of Maya Lin's really sort of brilliant design here. And of course, you can go there and take rubbings of the names of people that you know that have passed. So I mean, I also think it's brilliant because it's so personal on that level too. You go and you connect with someone you know. You can take home a piece of it in this way. And so she's really conceived of a public monument as kind of an earthwork, but in a totally different way, in a profoundly new way, a revolutionary way than the monuments in America had been built. One last site I wanted to show you of Maya Lin's before we finish up is her design for the Civil Rights Memorial at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. And she did this work in 1989. There's a lot of shades of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial here, but we've got the great quote from Martin Luther King, "Until justice rolls down like waters." And of course, that's a panel of black granite that has water rippling down over it. And just behind this young boy here, there's this round table that sort of functions like a clock or like a timeline of the civil rights movement. And again, it has water sort of pooling down over it, but you, the viewer, the visitor, can go and touch all of these things and experience and like physically connect with these important moments and these important figures from the history of the civil rights movement. So Maya Lin's work has been, like I said, widely celebrated. In 2009, she won the National Medal of Arts, and this is her receiving that award from President Obama. So she, I think, just has created some incredibly powerful works, and on such a large scale too. So I think in many ways she embodies that sense of fierceness, because she's, really sort of bucking expectations and traditions. So we'll wrap up with just looking ahead. What comes next for women? And I just have a few posters from the Guerrilla Girls who we had looked at before, because sometimes even their very old posters from several decades ago can speak volumes. So here they say, "You're seeing less than half the picture without the vision of women artists and artists of color." And I'm so happy to hear that we're having these conversations more and more, talking about bringing more people to the table and having a more diverse perspective. And I don't think we often think about how much we lose, particularly in the art world, by not seeing and sharing the perspective of female artists. So here, the Guerrilla Girls again. Being angry is a great place to start if you want to start changing all of these norms within the art world or within any other culture. And we're just, to end on a hopeful note, we're just beginning to see sort of interesting changes. So sadly, female artists made little progress in museums since 2008, but you have places like the Baltimore Museum that decide to exclusively collect works by women in 2020. And I think that's a brave and wonderful thing to do. And I hope that it inspires other institutions to make similar changes. So that is where we will wrap up for tonight. I really appreciate all of your attention, and I welcome any of your questions now.
So Jane, thanks so much. That really was wonderful.